Good evening to all of you. My name is Raj Kumar. I'm the founding Vice Chancellor of OP Jindal Global University. On behalf of JGU, as well as my collaborators in this endeavor, Education World, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you to this eminent educators colloquium on the theme Agenda Setting for Leadership, specifically on today's topic, the future of education, implementing the National Education Policy 2020. I have with me a very distinguished set of educators who have kindly agreed to give their time, and I will shortly introduce them. Before I do that, let me introduce the theme of this evening's discussion. In many ways, the National Education Policy has reimagined the future of education. Indian education system required a much needed overhaul for a long time, and the NEP 2020 has brought forward a scope to implement a number of progressive changes in the education system. The focus on early childhood care and education, the restructuring of the school system from 10+2 to 5+3+3+4 model, following the developmental needs of students in terms of curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment are some of the most critical recommendations of NEP 2020. That is focused on play-based methods in the first 5 foundational years, preschool, nursery, kindergarten, class 1 and 2. At various different stages, different forms of enhancements have been proposed, including experiential learning, vocational education, learning methods, subject-oriented pedagogy, and flexibility of choice in courses. The pedagogical focus is on critical thinking, problem solving, and decision-making. In fact, the most important 21st century skills that we have been deliberating during these Future of Education colloquium series have all been embedded across the school education system in the NEP 2020. While these are some of the more progressive and thoughtful policy directives in the NEP 2020, many eminent educators and academics are conscious of the actual implementation on the ground, with inadequate resources in many schools, including the lack of necessary quality teacher education and professional development programs in the country. In fact, one of our own presidential award-winning eminent educators in India, who has been in this colloquium before, Dr. Amita Wattal, who participated in that series a few weeks ago as a speaker, highlighted recently in an article in the Indian Express and said the greatest challenge facing us is teacher training. Hence, during this colloquium, we'll specifically deliberate on the challenges of implementing NEP 2020 in Indian schools. We will learn from the eminent educators in this colloquium what are the challenges that they envisage in implementing NEP 2020 recommendations in their own schools and across the country. Let me take this moment to introduce my distinguished guests. We have with us Mr. Rohan Bhatt, who is the chairman of Children's Academy Group of Schools, Mumbai. Having been schooled in Children's Academy himself, Mr. Bhatt understood the prerequisites of holistic and inclusive education that will lead the institution to the next level. He stepped into his father's shoes in the year 1991, and since then, there has been no looking back. He followed the founder's pedagogical principles, but kept moving ahead with the rapidly changing times to give the academy a much wider presence as years progressed. Mr. Bhatt always keeps himself abreast of the most intricate processes that take place within the school system. Thank you very much, Mr. Bhatt, for joining us. We have with us Ms. Brinda Ghosh, who is the principal of Gyan Shri School, Noida. Ms. Ghosh is a highly accomplished educationist, holds an international diploma for teachers and trainers from Cambridge, London, besides a post-graduation in English literature. She has taught and been in different leadership roles in some of the best institutions in the country, like Vikasa, Madurai, Wellam Girls School, Dehradun, Ivy League, Hyderabad, and YPS, Patiala. She has the unique distinction of being the founder principal of 2 schools, JGIS, Ahmedabad, and Ecole Global International Girls School, Dehradun. Ms. Ghosh is a trainer par excellence and believes in bringing in a progressive edge to pedagogical methods in and outside the classroom. She promotes inclusive education and is trained to deal and take corrective measures with children with learning disabilities, especially dyslexia. Thank you very much, Ms. Ghosh, for joining us.
Thank you.
We have with us Ms. Maya Norullah, who is the principal of Hopetown Girls School, Dehradun. Ms. Norullah is a graduate in English literature from Delhi University. She started her career as a teacher at Woodstock School, Missouri, which at the time offered the American high school system. She moved on to Wellam Boys School, Dehradun, an ISC school where she was appointed head of English department. In 1991, Ms. Norullah moved on to the British School, New Delhi. She introduced the International Baccalaureate Diploma program to the school. In 2005, Ms. Norullah moved to Pathways Word School and took over as the principal of the senior school there. Thank you very much, Ms. Norullah. We have with us Dr. M. Srinivasan, who's the founder and chairman of Gifted Education Research Foundation, Bengaluru. He was invited to set up a pioneering school at Gurgaon, Rotary Public School. His 4 years of hard work there culminated in developing a strong desire in him to set up an exclusive school for gifted education. After a decade in Oman, he returned to India. His dream school took shape in Bengaluru in 1995 with the establishment of Gear Foundation, with the belief that Gear belongs to its children. Mr. Srinivasan was awarded an honorary DLET by the Karnataka University for the pioneering and futuristic model of education that he had heralded in India. Under his leadership, Gear has been recognized in several different forums. And last but not the least, Mr. Dilip Thakur, my co-conspirator, the publisher and editor of Education World and Parents World. Since November 99, the publisher editor of Education World, the human development magazine. Education World, as many of you know, is India's and perhaps Asia's first education news and analysis magazine with a national leadership comprising academics, parents, and high school students. Their estimated readership is about 1 million across the country. Earlier, he was founding editor of Business India and Business World, India's first 2 business magazines, which contributed to economic liberalization and deregulation initiative of 1991. Once again, welcome to all of you, my panelists. My first question is to Ms. Ghosh. Ms. Ghosh, from an educator's perspective, what do you think are the 3 big changes that the National Education Policy 2020 brings, which, according to you, were long overdue and had to be brought about? And why do you rate them as the most important changes that the NEP brought about?
First of all, thank you for inviting me for this to speak at this colloquium. I think if you have to, kind of number the points from the NEP, which I feel are going to be maybe revolutionary to some extent and are really good. One is, I think, the emphasis. First one is on paper, what I see, the emphasis on teacher training, and also the emphasis on equipping teachers with a 4-year integrated training program. If this really happens, that is going to be a very, very welcome gesture. The second thing I feel is the emphasis on experiential learning, because if true learning has to happen, it has to be connected to life. And I think if experiential learning happens in its true sense, then it is going to change the way our children learn. So that's the second big point for me. And the third one is the multidisciplinary aspect of choosing subjects. Because to a large extent, though, boards do allow this. CBSE board as well as the ICSE board does allow choosing of subjects from different streams. But unfortunately for us, in a lot of schools, this opportunity is not given to the students. A science student, however good he may be or interested he may be in history, may not be allowed to take history as a main subject along with physics and chemistry and drop something else. That possibility does not exist now. But if this happens, then there will be another totally different outlook that the children will have. And yes, as popular as liberal arts is becoming in colleges, I hope that this kind of a multidisciplinary thing will extend to schools, to high schools also, and then make learning again more meaningful for the students and more enjoyable also. So to me, these are the 3 big points. There are others also, but you asked for 3, so I've told you about the 3 which are topmost on my mind.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ghosh, for setting the stage for this evening's discussion. Let me move to Ms. Norullah. Well, Ms. Norullah, in the same vein, and possibly as an extension to the previous question, what do you think are the 3 big, let's say, aspects that could have been covered by the NEP, but for various reasons, it was just not there? What are the 3 reforms that you were expecting that could have been dealt with by the NEP?
Well, I have to say that one of the first things that struck me when I read the NEP at great length, and it's a very interesting document, was that it had perhaps an unreal perspective of what a majority of government schools currently are like, and government aided schools as well, and private schools as well, all over some of the rural areas. Particularly, I can only speak for Garhwal, but there is no sense of reform of that sort of level that is required by a lot of these schools in this area, and perhaps right across the country as well. And I'll give you an example. Not very long ago, I took a bunch of girls up into the higher regions of Garhwal, looking for a primary school where they could do an IYP project. And one of the schools that we decided that we were going to work on was this small school, about 2.5 hours drive away from Dehradun, up about 7,000 feet in the Chakrata Mountains. It was a school which was a primary school, had about 30 children aged 4 to 8, and they all were taught by one teacher. The school was aided by the local temple, had very little money. The classrooms were completely decrepit. The walls were caving in, they were damp. The school was built on the edge of a cliff, and the cliff had absolutely no fencing. So there were all these little ones running around in the most dangerous sort of situation. They had hardly any books to read and absolutely no infrastructure at all. And this is a school which is, the only school in the village. Now, I don't see that the NEP has addressed that level of reform. I think, in a sense, the NEP is rather idealistic, and it's looking perhaps more at schools in larger cities and metros. I don't think they have a realistic sense of what schools are actually like in rural areas. So that I thought was one omission, that there should have been perhaps more research in that area before the NEP was actually written. That's one. The other, and this perhaps comes from my IB background and the enormous passion I feel for the IB program, is that the NEP seems to me to be rather insular in a sense. And that is a bit frightening. And the reason for that is, it's a wonderful thing to focus on your mother tongue language, to ensure that you have a curriculum which is really strong in enabling children to understand their history and their culture and their geography and their economies and their politics and the works. Of course, that's absolutely critical to any educational system. But the world is a small place today, and children are traveling, they're transient, they're looking for universities abroad, they're looking for jobs abroad, and at all levels of society. So it's not just people who can afford rich universities. We have carpenters and nurses and cooks and doctors also looking for jobs abroad. But there is nothing in the NEP curriculum which focuses on global understanding, of understanding other people's cultures, which I think is critical when you're preparing children for life ahead. And this is going to be, increasingly more necessary because we have such a large population of young people who are never going to be able to find opportunities and jobs in India. They're going to be looking abroad, and they're going to go into alien cultures.
Gotcha.
And they're going to have to be able to handle life. So that is, I thought, was the second most critical omission. Have I overstepped?
Yeah. Yeah. No, very good. I mean, I think in fact, I would say you've layered it out very well, because some of those things are much more than two, actually, in a way. So let me move to Dr. Srinivasan. Dr. Srinivasan, one thing is, most people have acknowledged the fact that the policy provides a futuristic aspiration for Indian education. And what both Ms. Ghosh and Ms. Nurullah did talk about is that despite certain aspects have not been covered adequately, or let's say a more nuanced approach dealing with some aspects, there is widespread consensus among the education community that this has the potential to be a game changer. So my question to you is that, what is the possible gap between the rhetoric of policy and the possibility of implementation? Now, the policies are based on intent, but between intent and outcomes, the gaps could be huge, sometimes even unsurmountable. Several of the good ideas of our first education policy were never implemented in spirit. This is also the case with the National Curriculum Framework 2005 or many other such documents. So my question is, do you see it will be something different this time, and why you say so?
Well, thank you for this opportunity. See, this policy is a very, very enthusiastic policy and very open-minded policy, open-ended to be very, very, what can I say, clued up to do this. So we have to look at what the policy has proposed rather than worrying about what it has not done. Since it's an open-ended policy, whatever it has not expressed, we can incorporate. I have a feeling this will give tremendous opportunity for those who have got enthusiasm and commitment to do something positive for education. If somebody wants to go by routine, this may not help. So it's a great opportunity for teachers to show up and come up. They have to learn, they have to read, they have to update themselves and contribute to the evolution of education. It won't be the same routine type anymore, because as I see, the differences between a school doing well and not doing well is going to increase. It is going to be phenomenally different. So much so, it can either result in competition or heartburn. I think in education, if we are awake and alert, both are good. If there's a heartburn, we can set it right. If it is enthusiastic, we can follow it. So I see a great opportunity, but we need to kind of, opportunity should not go waste. We should exploit that. That's what I like to say. Though there are very important aspects which are not covered. One is, we have good teachers who become bad principals. The Peter's principle, everybody reaches his utmost incompetent level. We have not looked at that one aspect of giving leadership training to teachers who can become principals. Number two, the policy doesn't look at private schools and public schools as two different entities, though we are two different, we are taking care of half each. 50% of students are in private schools, 50 are in public schools.
I thought it will be more in private. Am I right, Dr. Mutsami? Or
it will be the case. As of today, statistics says 50-50.
Okay.
But every year it will increase. Have we provided for that? No. Since the policy has not provided, the schools have to provide it. So I feel more positive roles, leadership roles for private schools.
Thank you very much, Dr. Srinivasan, for those very valuable comments. Let me move to Mr. Bhatt. Mr. Bhatt, so in some ways, the discussion that we are having today is also in the context of the existing gap that prevails between, the policy level, let's say, thinking and the implementation. Now, I want to move beyond the discourse on private schools and ask you a question. Now, at present, this is just a policy document. Since education is in the concurrent list, its implementation will depend upon support from state governments. Even for central institutions like CBSE, ICSE, Kendra Vidyalayas, several new legislative frameworks need to be framed and enacted before the policy can concretely start impacting the way we educate our students. So my question is that what are some of the low-hanging fruits that this newly imagined Ministry of Education can implement within possibly the next 6 months to a year and start having some marginal impact on the ground, given the political impetus that the policy has already created?
First of all, let me thank you and Open Jindal Global University, and of course, Mr. Dilip Thakur and Education World for giving me an opportunity to speak my views here in this colloquium. As far as your question is concerned, I look at NEP that any changes that are required to be done have to be looked at three levels. One is the legislative changes that will have to be seen. The next is the administrative changes, and the third is the academic changes. Now, the problem with this implementation, as you were discussing with Dr. Srinivasan, is that the whatever we want to do, whatever the vision statement is there in the NEP, for this to happen, the most important changes that is required is to be in the legislation. The rules and regulations have to be formed, the laws have to be formed. Now, what I see it as that the government will not take up matters which costs money because they don't have the finance for making the changes. So that is why the changes that you see, the drastic changes that are supposed to come, as you correctly suggested, that they are quite a distant, they'll be coming at quite a distant time. It is not going to come so soon. Like if you talk about the B.Ed, changes in the B.Ed, the changes in the number of students, and all these things are going to take a lot of time. The number of subjects that are going to learn, number of teachers that have to be appointed, they are all going to take money and they're going to take time. And the second, the administrative changes are also a nightmare for the government. If you look at, even if you see it Maharashtra, if you see grade 5, 6, 7, nobody knows for sure whether it is in the primary or it is in the secondary. Because they are paid from one section and they are working for some other section. So these are the issues that are there. So ultimately what is left for immediate implementation, which doesn't cost money to the government or even to the private administrators. And the second, the administrative changes, which is a very, very slow moving process in the government, as far as the government is concerned. These two changes are going to take time. So the low hanging fruits are the ones which are in the academic part. And to put my point, that one most important change that which can be done in the next 6 months is something which they have been trying to do for a very long time. That is the continuous assessment. That is what the assessment of students, which is we want to move to this continuous assessment mode. But there are certain hurdles. I know it is not going to be so easy, but the teaching and the assessment patterns can change. Because as you change the assessment pattern, it is not a small thing. It is a major change, because when you change your assessment pattern, it forces the change in the teaching pedagogies, the teaching methodologies. That is what actually happens. So if we target that we are able to change the, suppose we take up that 8th standard at least in the coming year 2021-22 and the 11th standard, start making changes in the assessment pattern of the children. Go for continuous assessment patterns. In that case, it is possible that we start off with the lower class and then move in the next couple of years. We are able to make the changes up to the grade 10 and grade 12. Now, when we do that, the simultaneous changes also take place in the lower classes, because schools basically would be looking at training children for the upcoming board examinations. And so when we know as a school that we require to teach our children to be assessed in a particular way, the methodologies of our teaching also change. So this is one thing which I feel is that we can target immediately. They are not very capital intensive. At the same time, getting help from NGOs and from getting help from private schools, even for the government schools or the schools which are at maybe at a little lower level, may not be the mainstream schools, but slum schools kind of things. There also the collaboration between good schools and this can happen. one teacher, one good teacher can train 60 good teachers. So that is one thing which I feel that the change that they are looking at can be acquired if we start off immediately and we take it up in a proper sense with proper teachers training. So that's the one of the things that I can say. Maybe there are other things, but this is one important change which I feel can be started immediately.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bhatt, for flagging that. Let me go to Dilip. Dilip, you have been among many of us as somewhat of a bit of a, a skeptic when it comes to government leading reforms. So let me ask you, a question which resonated in this discussion, that very surprisingly, the policy document is mute on private schools. It has failed to recognize their importance and role in educating a lot of young people. In fact, data, as we all know, as it was mentioned before, nearly 50%, but maybe more, of school students enrolled in nearly 5 lakh private schools. Now, given this data, one would have expected that a strong and a substantive section to be dedicated to private school education was quite obvious. Now, do you read the policy in the same way? Is it somewhat of another level of indifference to something that has been in existence, but there are inherent biases and prejudices that are against the role of the private sector in school education and higher education, that has made this huge miss in the policy document itself?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's one of the shocking omissions of the policy is that it hardly talks about private school education, which, as you rightly, as so many speakers have pointed out, educate 50% of the population. And in fact, there's an exodus from government schools into private schools because, let's face it, government schools are utterly irresponsible. Teachers don't attend, no accountability. And and the only reference made to private schools is that they engage in the commercialization of education and that they exploit it. There's a hangover from this socialist past, which has been abandoned all over the world. In fact, I always believe government, the whole thing that's wrong with this policy is that there's too much government. If you look in higher education, there are about some 10 new regulatory agencies. Similarly, in school K-12 education, you have the Ministry, Directorate of Education, then SSRA, and God knows, and then apart from that, you have the state regulatory bodies, you have the fees committees. I mean, really, it's just too much bureaucratization, and the track record of the government in education is totally uninspiring. As you know, that the ACER reports repeatedly point out that class 5 children can't read class 2 textbooks, do a simple division sum. So I think there's a deep ingrained bias, which is the hangover of the socialism of the 60s and 70s against private initiatives in education. And actually, that's in this policy, that's the elephant in the room, which the authors of the policy have refused to recognize. The whole point is that you just can't improve the education system unless you acknowledge the contribution and encourage government schools to learn from the private sector. Because the entire middle class of this country has been created by private education. All these people who run the country, the establishment, they've all come out of private education. You've got to, in this day and age, you've got to have high quality education. And this business about, the government, unqualified government people telling vice chancellors and others every step of the way to report to some agency or the others, frankly ridiculous. And it's this is a grave Achilles heel of the policy. And I'm rather pessimistic about it's being implemented correctly.
Thank you very much, Dilip. And for all the viewers, we are live on Facebook and YouTube. Very shortly after this part of the, this discussion, I'll take questions from you. So please send in your questions as we move forward in this discussion. Let me move to Ms. Ghosh. Ms. Ghosh, one of the major challenges in school education is the hurdles that our bureaucratic system creates for quote unquote, an entrepreneur who wants to open a private school. In fact, even the use of the word entrepreneur is not allowed, though within business, we use, particularly in business education, social entrepreneurship is a widely accepted phenomenon. Now, do you see that the National Education Policy 2020 paving way for reforms to ease the situation, particularly when it talks a bit about, regulatory reforms, or, as some cynics have argued, the red tapeism, corruption, and bureaucratic lethargy and indifference will continue and potentially undermine some of the noble intentions of the people who are leading the effort to formulate the national education policy? Ms. Ghosh.
If you look at the national education policy, as Mr. Thakur has just pointed out, we really don't have any sense of this happening, in the sense that the private schools have not been given any kind of a recognition or a mention in the policy. That's a fact. And there is no guarantee that the private school will be recognized for what they contribute to the society in terms of educating the masses. So I really don't know. I don't think that this is really a positive sign. And as far as some entrepreneur wanting to open a school, I think that should be encouraged. But if you're asking whether it is there as a possibility that we see in the NEP, no, nothing is so obvious. And yes, given the condition in our country and the way things have been functioning so far, there is every possibility that again, the bureaucracy takes over, and truly those who know about education are not really considered, their opinions are not taken. So this could be a view. However, what I have seen now, as soon as this NEP has been shared with all of us, there is at least an attempt to get our suggestions. We have been sent questionnaires. We have been asked to, give our opinion as to what we find is lacking in the NEP point-wise. And school teachers, school principals have been encouraged to actually participate in this survey and to point out the probably the flaws in the NEP, and also to make suggestions as to what could correct it. So maybe this could be one of the things that could be suggested, that we need to look at a module of functioning where we don't have to necessarily all the time be governed by bureaucratic governing bodies. So I really don't know the possibility whether this will happen. And there's a lot of politics involved in the whole thing, because the present government has got this initiated. We don't know whether the same government will remain in power a few years later, and whether this policy will see the daylight before the next election actually happens. So yes, if you have to be cynical, yes, there are a lot of things that we can be cynical about. But at the same time, I think we can look at a lot of things that can be implemented at school level. So I, as a principal, feel that there are a lot of good policies, a lot of good things in this policy that we can actually adapt without waiting for it to be imposed on us.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ghosh, for your candidness, but also the hopefulness in which you responded to that question. Let me go to Ms. Norula. Ms. Norula, one of the challenges is clearly the question of syllabus and curriculum. A lot of debate and discussions have happened for years about this issue. So the policy itself envisages somewhat of a reimagination of the syllabus for students. How realistic is this expectation? Can this happen in subjects, I don't know, physics or mathematics, especially for the senior classes? And even if it does, what kind of arbitrariness it is going to be, involved? I mean, what would be an alternative to a top-down fiat from school boards to cut, say, specific chapters or topics? Of course, it's one thing for COVID-19 to create a situation of, let's say, lessening the burden. But can this be a sustainable model?
Well, I think one of the things that the NEP also suggests is not just cutting down the syllabus, but also breaking up the assessment, the final assessment over the last 2 years of schooling. So what they're looking at is alternative assessments, which I think is a very good idea. The pressure right now is a tough syllabus. at 1 year syllabus in which you're examined at the end of the year, and everything depends on that one exam that you take. And I think that causes the greatest stress. But if assessment is scattered through 2 academic years and the assessment varies, then I think the load will be a lot lighter for students taking their final examinations. So that's one thing. And the other is, of course, this movement away from this package of subjects that all our children have to take these days, which is an ISC student, for instance, will have to have English and a total of 5 subjects, some which they may not find so relevant in their last 2 years of schooling. So I think that is also an area which is likely to be reviewed, which I completely endorse. I think that's a good idea. To have subjects taught at intensive levels and to have subjects taught at standard levels as well. And these are systems which are followed in the UK, in the Americas. It's also an IP thing. So, and it
A lot
works.
of the schools in India have it too, if they're doing an international course.
That's right. And it works very well.
Absolutely.
I'm very hopeful of this work.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Arula, for that. Let me move to Dr. Srinivasan. Dr. Srinivasan, there's a lot of focus in the policy on foundational literacy and numeracy among children. Now, what do you think should change in schools to ensure that these goals are met? Of course, part of it is also about the emphasis that has been given in the STEM context as well. And now please help us understand this with separate focus on the government schools, low-cost private schools, and of course the mainstream private schools. To what extent different frameworks of governance in these schools will actually shape our own capacity to contribute to this foundational literacy and numeracy that has been talked about in the policy itself?
Well, that's a very good question. If you talk of foundational literacy and numeracy, it per se excludes the other aspects which are more important. At the age of 3 to 6, they need tremendous amount of opportunity to explore. The word exploration is not there in the policy at all. In fact, education for children at this age depends on their ability to explore and opportunity to explore. Next set, up to the age of, let's say, 11 or 12, it is the experimental learning. They have to experiment with their own thoughts, with their own facilities and resources. The experiments are not what is done in the labs. In the labs, the statistics is cooked up. We know what we should get. That is not experiment. So these two main aspects of learning at this stage has been ignored. And that's mainly because there was no school educator in the committee. It's all from universities which has trickled down to school policies.
Correct.
The ground reality has not come up. If you study brain development, it will support my idea that how a child should be stimulated in the beginning and then taken up for learning based on what the child already knows. It is a step-by-step process which has not been taken into because they are emphasizing only on the numeracy and literacy, which is an issue only in public schools. It is not an issue in private schools. Private schools are doing a lot of innovations. They are doing differentiated learning possible for children. So my general idea is that they have framed a policy for the public schools and they have added the private schools also. I think that's not a very, very healthy practice.
Thank you very much, Dr. Srinivasan, for enlightening us on that point. Let me move to Mr. Bhatt. Mr. Bhatt, one of the less talked about areas historically in our educational context is the role of skills development and vocational education. Now, the policy does focus some parts of it on skill development. Vocational subjects are likely to be introduced across the board. Now, how do you see this particular step now, given the fact that the appetite for experiential learning or even engaging with the community has not necessarily been met with a lot of excitement and enthusiasm, maybe to a large extent from the parents as opposed to students. Now, do you think the students will be enthusiastic about such courses, especially students from, let's say, upper middle class families?
as far as this is concerned, I think it's a very positive development as in the NEP. This is something which we have not been focusing on so far. We have to look at it as maybe in a different manner. If we introduce these subjects as fun subjects, as what is written in the NEP, they want to introduce this as a fun subject, and then from there carry on. If you are looking at replacing subjects, then as you say, the middle class and the upper middle class are not interested in this kind of subjects which are their vocational subjects, which we call, and they still live in the thought that their child should become an engineer or a doctor or something like that. So that is where the resistance comes. But when you introduce this as a fun subject, which may be changed even every 6 months, something for the children to do. Children as such love to do such kind of things. If you teach a pottery, or you teach carpentry, or you teach gardening to a student, any student loves it. But the problem starts with when you start assessing these subjects, and when you start taking it as something that is having a future, then the parents would definitely resist. But it will definitely help the children to find in future, take it up as a vocational course. So how you start it and how you move about it is important. Academically, because there will be always academically challenged students who are there, and for them this can become a good base to have a vocation in future. Since we are not at all exposed to this at present, what happens is the children who are academically are a bit behind, who are academically lagging, these children are the ones who suffer the most today, because they are not learned any other skill except the reading writing skills, and that comes of no use to them when it comes to the market, the employment market. When you come there, their skills are zero, because there is always somebody much better than them who can fill up that post. So this is something which I feel is, even if the parents are not very enthusiastic, of course it has got its own problems, like creating the infrastructure for it, and getting the teachers for it. All these things are definitely going to be there, but starting it as a subject, I am completely for it. I think it is a good step, and it should help. At least if the progression doesn't happen, then it is lost. If the progression happens well into development of vocational subjects and carry on to become a vocation for the student, I think it is a very progressive step. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Bhatt. Dilip, let me move to a more difficult question for you, because you speak about policy and write about it as well. Now, for the private schools, financial sustainability is a major concern. At one level, we have a situation where the policy document is silent on the role of private schools. Now, we have a situation right now that due to COVID-19, several schools had to relieve teachers and staff due to financial constraints. Now, one of the concerns that the private schools have less publicly talked about, but more deeply concerned, is that there are provisions of the NEP that, once implemented as a legal provision, will have major financial implications for private schools. Given that 50% of our students study in private schools, what could the government do to ensure better financial viability of private education institutions, besides, of course, providing a lot more freedom within the context of autonomy that the private schools need to enjoy in determining their financial situation?
Well, almost all states have passed legislation as they call it, regulating tuition fees and other fees. And in fact, in Gujarat, there's a ceiling, a very unrealistic ceiling on the kind of fees that schools can charge. Really, this is totally, I think it's unconstitutional, perhaps as a lawyer, because you should know in Article 30 of the Constitution, as amended by the TMA Pai judgment, every citizen has a right to set up, to promote, to establish and administer a school of his choice. And I think this is also well settled in law, that schools are allowed to make reasonable profit, the TMA Pai judgment. In the light of all that, It's amazing that the NEP is completely silent about tuition fees charged or chargeable by private schools. And this is potentially going to be a very debilitating and demoralizing effect on private schools. Because at all levels, there's just too much interference. They somehow, the bureaucrat, the Neta Babu Brotherhood, they just don't trust academics. They don't believe academics can manage their own institution when most of them are much better qualified than generalist academics from Hindi heartland states to run their own school. They don't need to be told at every step what are the fees you should charge, what are the language you should have, what is who are the kind of people you have to have in your school, what are the subjects you need to teach, you have to be multidisciplinary. I think this is the fundamental flaw of this policy because it's a continuation of the existing policies of the past. That is control, command. And they have and evidence, there's a mountain of evidence to show this hasn't worked. And the public, the government schools are a living example that this kind of control and command system has not worked. I think the whole policy, the fundamental flaw in this policy, there's just too much government, too much governance, too much hand-holding, too much direction, too much control, too much command. And this also applies to fees. Now, it's axiomatic. You can't have first world education, which all parents want, and at third world prices. You just can't have it. And it's amazing that the bureaucracies 70 years later have not understood this. And they make a distinction between philanthropic schools and, other kind of schools. It's absurd. I mean, so I think you're right. It's these kind of controls and command and fees and all is going to really affect the viability of schools. It's going to, they have to cut corners somewhere. And that's going to affect the overall standard of education, which is not good for the country.
Well, thank you, Dilip. That was a hard-hitting set of observations. The only, quick response I will give as not only a moderator, but as an education is that one of the concerns that a larger part of the policy establishment, even political establishment, is conscious of is that to what extent we can provide more diversity and inclusion within our education institutions. And one belief is that if you are able to regulate to some extent fees, then in that process, you're also regulating the kind of access and equity and inclusion that becomes important, not only from a political standpoint, but also from an egalitarian standpoint. But I'm sure there are better ways to do that than creating blanket sort of limitations on the part of institutions. All right, so let me
incentivize. Just a second. They can incentivize scholarships.
Yeah, correct. I agree with you, and that's probably the better way to do it, where affordability can be measured through income and other means, and the most deserving people could have a differential fee structure, and that's exactly what we should be doing.
It's happening in many colleges, including your own.
Yes, right? Very true. Very true. All right. So for those of you who are viewing, please send in your questions. We are live on Facebook and YouTube. Let me quickly move to my third round of questions with this amazing group of educationists we have with us this evening. Ms. Ghosh, let me talk about something that is hugely contested as we speak. Now, this is, of course, a different context in which I'm going to ask this question, the whole issue of examinations and assessment. Now, the NEP brings back continuous and comprehensive evaluation. A lot of focus is on formative assessment. Pedagogically, it's a very important element and can prove to be very useful in improving educational quality. Yet, we know that this is drawn extensively from the National Curricular Framework of 2005. Now, we need to ask some questions. Why did it not succeed in the first place in NCF 2005? And do you think the policy creates the enabling provisions that will make it a success this time? What factors do you think will be crucial for its success? As we know, this is one of the most contested aspects of a school governance or even an education institution governance.
Okay, so this is something that is close to my heart. I believe that the assessment has to be assessment for learning. And the NEP does touch upon that, at least as a principle, that assessment should be assessments for learning. There's a lot of stress, as you rightly said, on formative assessment, as it should be. how well are we going to implement this? And your question about CCE not having been a success when it was introduced through the NCF 2005. Well, it wasn't a success because given the size of the schools in our country, it did not, the training, the sufficient amount of knowledge about actually implementing CCE in the classroom was insufficient, absolutely insufficient. A lot of teachers, even today, even in progressive schools, hardly know what exactly formative assessment is and how it should be implemented in the classroom. So therefore we failed because we failed to train the people who were supposed to implement it in their classroom. It's ridiculous because a lot of people continue to believe that formative assessment simply means, giving very objective questions like fill in the blanks and, match the following and so on and so forth. So it's nothing except that we failed to provide the kind of training that should have been done. And had training gone and reached right where it should have reached, I'm sure it could have been a success. CCE is the best thing that can happen. And where training has been provided, a lot of us, we still continue to use CCE. And I am an advocate of comprehensive and continuous assessment because I think that that is something that really helps in the teacher knowing about her own practices and also helps the children to form their learning, to form what they are actually studying. And it helps in progression. So I believe that this can be achieved if the people who are implementing it have understood it correctly, if they're really truthful about the training programs that have been put down on paper, and if they spot the right kind of trainers, and if they actually implement this collaboration in schools, where people who are aware, where people who have already implemented this practice successfully are tapped to train other areas or other schools in areas which where training has not reached, then I think it can be done. Yes, the size of our country, the number of schools that we have is a challenge. Finance may be a challenge, but not that big a challenge, because I think if you identify people in a school, train one small section of the school, and then let them take over the training for the rest of the school, it can be done. So it needs careful planning at every level. And of course, the bureaucrats there have to understand this, that nothing can happen if this training is not done in phases, and if this training doesn't reach the last person in the rural area in the schools also. And I think where it has been understood and where training has happened, this is working beautifully.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ghosh, for that. Let me move to Ms. Nurullah. Another important issue that the NEP has covered and also has created a lot of debate and discussion across the country. Multilingualism has been another key focus of the policy. Now, we all, of course, know that it is beneficial for academic learning and life outcomes of students when they study in their mother tongue. Yet, as a principal, what are the challenges and practical hurdles in implementing this the policy within our private and government schools, where the student community is far more diversified than what it was, let's say, even a decade before? Given the experience of the past, do the policy suggestions of language teacher recruitment, training, and exchange, do they look realistic to you?
Not in the least. I mean, just the thought of implementing something like that in a residential school where you have children from different states is an absolute nightmare. I think that it's a great idea that all children learn their mother tongue language. I think that's absolutely critical. And it is also true that very young children, pick up languages very easily, and that's the time to be actually able to train them. But I'm a language teacher. I'm a literature teacher, really. I'm an English teacher, so I'm speaking from that perspective. Language is taught to children as a mode of communication. That is the only purpose. The only objective is that you, at the end of a school term, children are able to speak a language fluently, and they're able to understand a language fluently when they listen to it being spoken. And that is the sole objective. But here the objective is a little different, which is what is, of course, complicating issues. It's not just appreciation of the written word, learning Sanskrit, for instance, or learning some of our reading and studying some of our old literatures, etc. That's language appreciation. It's not language learning. So I think they've got a little bit mixed up with that. The other is that it's a bit irrelevant today with our generation. And if you look at the kind of language our kids are using now, and the language they're communicating with is the language on social media, which is, short sentences, which is Hindi written in the English script. It is emojis and pictures, etc. That is their mode of expression. And I think what the NEP needed to do also was to be able to look at what the new generation, how the new generation is actually communicating. So that is one area which I think has been left out completely. It's going to be a living nightmare for schools like ours to implement such a thing, but I'm very hopeful that the states will intercede in that.
Thank you very much.
May I add a point here?
Please go ahead.
I also feel that when you're talking about, multilingualism and, educating the child in its mother tongue, what happens in mixed marriages where, the mother's mother tongue is different and the father's mother tongue is different? What is the mother tongue for that child?
Absolutely. These are very important issues that need to be addressed, and also the geographical mobility, not only in residential schools, but in a country where people are increasingly moving from the places where they were born and brought up to other places where the work takes them. How do you bring that in? It raises a whole range of issues. It's one of those things where there is a noble intention behind it, but clearly when it comes to implementing it, we're going to face numerous challenges. All right, let me move to Mr. Butt. Mr. Butt, one of the biggest challenges that the policy has suggested, or other changes the policy has suggested, is that the shift away from the 10+2 system to what is being said as the 5+3+3+4. Now, of course, there are many educationists who have welcomed it. It is in line with some of the well-known, let's say, school systems in different parts of the world. Now, at the ground level, what changes will this bring for the school systems as you see it? And how will individual institutions be impacted operationally and financially? Mr. Butt.
Yeah. Okay. I think this is a very important change that has happened, because basically what we are doing is the pre-primary, that is the most foundational years of a child, where we all know that this is something that between the 0 to 6 years is the major development in the mental and the physical abilities of the child take place. And this was 0 to 3 and 3 to 6. This part was completely ignored. And now when you are talking about 5+3+3+4 system, the most, and as per according to me, the one of the biggest plus point of NEP to 2020 is that they have integrated this pre-primary with the primary and the secondary schools. Because if you link all to your other previous question also about the numeracy and literacy, numeracy and the language literacy of a child, if you see most of them, as it was put up by the, I forgot who answered that question, but if you see the problem, I think Dr. Srinivasan answered that. If you notice that problem that he also pointed out is that this problem is there in the low budget schools and in the government schools, because I feel that the proper importance of learning has not been given at that particular stage. These children are directly pushed to the first standard level in the primary, in the previous system, without having any foundation. That is where the cognitive skills have to be developed. That is where the numeracy skills have to be developed. That is where all the important skills should have been psychomotor development. Everything should have taken place at that particular level. And when that is not being done, and these children, especially in the government school, are directly coming into school at grade 1 level. Now, when they come, there is a huge gap and they have a lot to catch up. So what happens is that when they are being, the teachers who are there, of course, they have their own problems because various other factors are also involved in that. But these children have to catch up with their writing skills. So basically, without giving them enough chance to develop their listening and speaking skills, without that, the writing skills take precedence. And when that happens, all the problems start. And that is why you find that problem that the children are lacking in the basic skills of even in math and in language both. So I feel that when you are bringing this together, it will make a big change. But that change is going to be very, very important. And that is where I feel is going to be a good change that is coming up. Let us hope that it will be useful.
Got you. Thank you very much for that. Let me move to Dr. Srinivasan. Dr. Srinivasan, this policy is very upbeat on assessment and measurement of learning outcomes. It makes provision for national and state level assessment agencies. The reality is that more than 50% of our students attend some kind of tuition or coaching classes after school hours. In senior classes, this percentage will be much higher. Now, can the assessments proposed segregate the impact of private tuitions on students' learning outcomes from that of actual learning happening within schools? And if not, what kind of value can such assessments bring for schools, teachers, and students?
I think we are addressing a very complex problem.
Yeah.
The complex problem is because what the coaching institutes are doing, the schools are not doing. We have to rectify this problem by changing our selection process, not the education process. In the education process, we may have to modify certain things, but what is taught in the school should be good enough for the child to take up the course, and it should be a long-term assessment that would help in selection and not one exam. Then what would happen? Schools would become a little more serious, and that will make the child get a chance or not. Coaching institutions are doing shortcut methods. There are many who are failing in IITs. Why? So it's better to improve the school system, which includes assessment, a fair assessment, correct assessment, and a long-term evaluation. Maybe from grade 6, you do it for every child and give a chance in IITs based on these things. In that case, the coaching institutions will have to do something different, which I don't know. We have a dichotomy between the child's knowledge or ability for taking up a certain course and not taking up a certain course. Why should the children suffer? If I don't want to go to engineering college, I can be an ordinary student. If I want to go to engineering student, I have to prime myself by going to a coaching institute. This has to be solved, and I don't think this policy can solve, because they have to fix their assessment process from possibly in the system of last 7 years of studies. In that case, they can do that.
Got you. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Srinivasan. Dilip, that's the last question, after which I'm going to take questions from the audience. So Dilip, we have been talking about the NEP, and while there is a lot of promise it holds in several areas, our educationists in the colloquium also talked about the number of areas where it requires more nuance and even possibly rethinking. So my question to you is that, what do you have to say to government agencies, government officials, state and central government, ministries and departments, as to how should they be approaching the implementation plan of NEP 2020, which will not only be able to fulfill the vision and aspirations of the policy, but also to a large extent address the concerns of the educationists as we heard today? Dilip.
Well, my advice to them would be, the first thing to do is to learn to respect the autonomy of educational institutions. I think that's the basic flaw of the NEP 2020, in that they feel, as I've said, I'm sorry if I repeat myself, they feel that education institutions have to be guided at every step. They have to be monitored and supervised at every step. Now, of course, it's true that some education institutions may not be totally child-centric, and they need some guidance. So that I think what was required in the education policy was broad guidelines to within which school principals, vice chancellors, others had to should operate. But if you want to achieve the fine aims, I mean the policy document is wonderful for its rhetoric, and it's wonderful in the way it spells out. That's why our cover story says visionary charter, but educacy shadow. You see, the whole point is it's a visionary charter. We want to make India a great country. We want to become a $5 trillion economy. And they understand that for that, you need to develop your human resource. But now, how do you develop your human resource? I don't think there's a standardized approach which comes from the ministries of education that's to do it, that can do it. You need to allow educationists maybe to do it in their own way, maybe allow 1,000 flowers to bloom. And then ultimately you're going to get real education, problem-solving capabilities, critical thinking skills, which are totally lacking in this country today, because really from independence today, we've not solved any of our problems. It's in industry, agriculture, population growth, low productivity, defense manufacture being self-sufficient, etc. We have not solved any of these problems. So obviously something is very wrong with the system of control and command. So I think the fundamental flaw of this whole system is that they are not leaving educationists like yourself to do your own jobs. I believe that you all know what you're doing, and even if you're not, there's a self-corrective mechanism by way of competition. So education should be left to do their work, and perhaps all go towards a particular goal along different paths. I don't think the framers of this policy have understood that that's possible. They think there's one standardized approach and that's the way you've got to do it. For example, all universities have to be multidisciplinary, large universities. But why? Some can be large, some can be small, some can be not multidisciplinary. But they should be told, yes, it's advisable that they should be multidisciplinary. And leave it to educators to decide what's best. Ultimately, if it's not good what you're doing, people are not going to come to your school or your institution. I think they need to understand that. That's a fundamental flaw.
Thank you very much, Dilip. All right.
Dr. Rajkumar, can I add a point?
Please, please.
See, you need tremendous resource in the country, and expert teachers whom we have at various schools are the greatest resource we have to make it bottom up, not top down. Those teachers can train other teachers to do fantastic things. We are not thought about novel and innovative ways of exploiting our resources. And again, the policy has not looked into it at all.
Correct. Well, thank you very much for that. All right, so let me now move to the questions that we have received. We have received over 25 questions. I'm going to pick and choose a few so that we can have some audience involvement in this absolutely fantastic debate. Let me go to Ms. Ghosh. Ms. Ghosh, there is a question, it's a very substantive, let's say, epistemological question as well. In a diverse country like India, can a single education policy work? Does NEP allow enough flexibility to accommodate the complexity and diversity of the country, but also the education systems that we have?
I don't think NEP is addressing that because it doesn't talk about the different boards that are prevalent. It does make a mention somewhere about schools also being able to function without really affiliating in due course of time. That's what I thought I understood of after reading the NEP. In a country like ours, it may be difficult, but the ideal situation would be to have one policy of education all over the country, given the fact that there is so much movement in the country. But whether it is practically going to be feasible is definitely something which is debatable and something worth thinking about. It can happen, but then again, you will be going in circles with regulations. So this is something that we need to think about. But I think we must have a uniform policy. In many ways, it will help because there shouldn't be so many discrepancies in the different systems that we have in the country. And that's certainly going to help.
Thank you very much. Ms. Narula, there's a very important question that many are asking, and this is Epari, Swatvik, but also others are asking. This question is about to what extent the vision of NEP is also addressing the challenge and aspiration of people to have meaningful employment after education, the big challenge of jobs. In some ways, the relationship between educational imagination and aspiration on the one hand, and the possibility to be empowered financially through meaningful job opportunities in the future.
Well, I think that is something that the NEP certainly does address. For instance, the options that students will have once they've passed out of school with a multidisciplinary course of study enables them to choose different options when they actually move on to university. And I'll give you an example. For instance, if a child has been able to in school choose physics and mathematics with art and maybe psychology, it opens up a range of different options to that child to be able to move on to university and follow areas of their strength in their career. Children at the age of 16 do not know 100% where their strengths lie. They only discover it as they grow older. And they cannot really make decisions. We all know that. We all know about brain development, etc. They cannot really make decisions until much later in their lives. So it enables that, even in the multidisciplinary approach in university. And I think that is a great plus of the NEP.
Thank you very much. All right, Dr. Srinivasan, there's a question from Rose Babu, and that's a question about, more on the implementation side of NEP. When it's a more logistical question, but an equally important question is this person is asking is that how will it be applied for all grades of students, and will it have different emphasis when it comes to different boards and different schools when it comes to its actual implementation?
Actually, the NEP should promote implementation at school level, not even at board level. See, the destination can be the same, the journey and the route can be different. Then only we will allow schools to kind of innovate and improve, reach the next stage. If it is all doing the same, it will not make any difference. So I think when they make rules and policies based on the NEP, they should allow each school to report, or like the ISO system, each school should say how they will implement and achieve this, and they should be allowed to do that. Wonderful. Otherwise, it will again a bureaucratic exercise, which will see only papers and papers being piled up. No real improvement may take place on the ground.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Srinivasan. Mr. Bhatt, there is a question from Mr. Narayana Rao. This is about the Right to Education Act. Again, quite surprisingly, the person is asking, what about the Right to Education Act? Why does the NEP not refer to it? It has given rise to many doubts about to what extent NEP is potentially committed to the RTE itself.
I think there are two different aspects, so there is no need to refer to it. The rights of the students or the right to education is a part of the NEP. When we bring what it has done is, as you see, we had in the RTE, there was no provision for including the pre-primary children or the children in the 11th and 12th grade to be a part of the RTE. Now here, this brings this whole thing, that right from the 3 years to your 12th standard, everything comes under RTE now automatically, because this has formalized. So it is a part of it. It has spoken. Of course, now coming to implementation, that's a different issue, because many things in RTE, only one thing people remember is no failure, and that's all that is there about RTE and about the admission that is being given to the economically backward. But there are other things that were there in the RTE which has been conveniently ignored, and which I spoke about. Like suppose the RTE also speaks about having a limited number of 30 students in a class. Now, again, what I told, it costs money, the infrastructure costs money, the teachers cost money. So the government was kept out of it. Like, you did not implement it at all. And the private schools were supposed to implement, but since the legislation is so weak, where the government itself is not implementing its own rules, then how do you enforce it on the privates? So the same thing is now spoken about in the NEP. And that is where our doubts start, that whether anything will actually change on the ground. So it is not that it has been completely, they need to speak about RTE, but they have formalized it in this, and they have expanded the scope of RTE in the NEP. That's my take on it.
Well, excellent. Thank you very much, Mr. Bhatt. Dilip, there's a perfect question for you. Raza Kazim is asking, is it not wise to shed the bureaucratic garb and move ahead with free, innovative intention to transform India? Is it not feasible to leave education to the education planners? It's almost like you planted this question, Dilip.
Yes, indeed. I think, whether it's in industry, whether it's in industry or in education, we have to move away from that control and command model. India is a very diverse country. There are very intelligent people in all parts of the country. I mean, ever since we started Education World, now it's now 20 years old, the kind of people I've met, the number of ideas they have, and as Dr. Srinivasan said, and I said earlier also, education policy should be a guideline. It should be a framework. And education should be free to take different paths to attain the same goal. And that's very important, that we need to move away from this control and command model. Let's face it, the fact is that these generalist bureaucrats are not the right people. They're not the right people to tell everybody how to improve education, how to conduct education, how to ensure good learning outcomes. I think that's surely logical. That this is the province of education. It's trained people like you all sitting here. You all are all trained in this business. You know how to do it, and you are answerable to your own publics. That's your parents, your students, and you're not answerable. Why should your students be answerable and give you an excuse, as it were, to say this is what the government told us to do? That's why we've done it. I think we should allow. I'm not a Maoist, but you should allow 1,000 flowers to bloom. Different people will implement different policies, but I think it will create a richness in Indian education which is totally lacking today. It's all an arid landscape, which characterized by dismal learning outcomes, miserable children, horrible infrastructure in government schools, teacher absenteeism. That system has failed. I think we should have a radical departure from that system.
Got you. All right. Thank you very much for that. Ms. Ghosh, there is a question, and not one, but many, talking about the gulf between the technology haves and the technology have-nots, particularly with regard to the digital divide. Now, all of us know, including the platform that we are talking today, there is, while many schools, colleges, universities are somewhat privileged, the fact is a large part of India particularly rural India, but also even urban contexts, simply do not have the technological, infrastructure, both in terms of having internet access, uninterrupted electricity, and an equipment. So the question that is being asked is that to what extent this, current emphasis on digitization can actually, and technology and online education has the potential to create an already existing digital divide far worse than what it is.
I think it's a little better than what is being portrayed, because I think with this, thanks to the COVID situation, a lot of digitalization in some ways is happening, and also in rural areas in some form or the other. I think technology has reached, and digital education is also being made available. The gap is not so big, and there are ways in which this gap can be narrowed. So if you were to, use collaboration over there, if systems are shared, and if you were to, I've been a great admirer of this theory of the hole in the wall by Sugata Mitra, where he talks about how this can actually, one set of a television can actually educate quite a population in a village or in a rural area. So digitalization can be enabled. It will take time and money. So that is something that we have to look at. But I don't see the gap widening. I think it is narrowing. I mean, my personal opinion is that of whatever I have, little I have seen and whatever I have experienced in these last few months. I feel that there are ways in which all these schools are being, the students in these schools are being reached also.
Well, thank you very much for that, Ms. Ghosh. Ms. Narula, there is a very interesting question, which I think all of us in education institutions are mindful of it. This is the question from Reena Saxena, and she's asking, as a counselor, I feel mental health of students need to be given more focus. Can we also emphasize on counselors' availability at all levels based on counselor and student ratio? Should this not be given a stronger emphasis than it has been emphasized?
Well, I think that it will be given a stronger emphasis. And I think the reason for that is this whole COVID-19 situation that we've been through. I mean, we have everybody talking about the need for counseling now and the mental health of children. I think there's been a focus on that over these last 5 months. So I certainly feel that if not the NEP, certainly schools are going to look at that, because the mental health of children is absolutely critical to their success. And most sort of principals of schools will implement that even before the NEP is implemented. So I'm very, very hopeful about that. And of course, there's such a lot of online counseling that's happening as well. There's so many resources available. It is not difficult anymore or a thing to be shamed of anymore. So counseling will happen. I'm very positive about that.
Well, thank you very much for that. Dr. Srinivasan, there is a very interesting question about, which we briefly talked about it. There has been a clamor for a very long time that we need to have significant, investment, GDP investment in higher education, as well as in, primary and secondary education. Now, will enough budgetary allocation be made to implement the vague conceptualizations in NEP? This is a question from Prema Raman Iyer. Should not the policy stress on producing, let's say, outcomes, specific outcomes, and what this investment will lead to?
See, our government needs to invest, but it should not be vague. They should invest on lending to entrepreneurs to put up facilities. The government should not implement it by itself. And number two, government cannot have enough money. That's what we see all over the world. No country in the world is able to put up all the facilities by themselves. But when the public participates, it is a phenomenal resource. So there should be a system for what do you call PPP or the charter school system of the states, so that public brings in money. Public takes some facility out of it. And lot of high standard schools have started all over the country. Now, even in poor rural areas, people are ready to invest. But how do they take the money back? They have to borrow from somebody. How do they return it to them? If they can solve this issue, government need not worry about the investment aspect. They can afford to spend how much ever they spend and have a great result. Also, I like to add, government can spend 6%, they can spend 20% also. More they spend, there'll be more leakage in the pipes, and ultimately end ground will get the same amount of water which they are getting today. If you have to change that, you'll have to change the mode of investment. That's what is my take.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Srinivasan. Mr. Bhatt, there's a question about the language issue, and it's coming up again. Nagendra Kumar is asking, could there be innovative ways by which this aspiration of the NEP can be addressed in schools without, let's say, completely, making it an impossible situation for students on the one hand, yet, because there are lots of studies around the world, particularly in formative years, the language aspect of learning could make a huge difference in the cognitive abilities. Is there a way out of this problem?
It's a very difficult issue as far as our country is concerned. I also believe that, that the formal learnings of the child should start in its mother tongue. But then, as we have already discussed, it's not an easy issue in our country. We have so many languages that it becomes difficult, and each state has its own language. People have been advocating a single language and have been talking about teaching in mother tongues in foreign countries like German, learning in Germany, in German, the French, learning in French in France. So these things are possible if the whole country has got one language.
Exactly.
Now, we cannot agree on one language. So when this issue is there, the problems are at the school level, that you may talk about multilingualism in your NEP, and you may speak about teaching in mother tongue, but it is just being politically correct. It is just nothing more than that.
Gotcha.
Let us see practically what happens. Let us see in Maharashtra, the English medium schools. We are forced to teach English because we are an English medium school. We have the national language, Hindi, which cannot be ignored because that is the language which actually connects in some way.
Mr. Bhatt, I will quickly correct you. As a constitutional law professor, it is the official language and not the national language.
Not national language. That's why I said it is not something that can be enforced.
Yes.
If it could be enforced, then the problem would
I agree with you. Yeah.
It's one of the official languages which is there, and that is the only language which is, because maybe you can give credit the TV videos and the cable TV and whatever, but it has come to some. So that is the language which we cannot ignore. The child has to learn that. Then the question of Maharashtra, Marathi comes into question. So now I am already done with 3 subjects. Now where do I bring up the next language? I cannot introduce a 4th language to the child now.
Got you.
This is the issue which is there, that we are already straight-jacketed, and I don't see an easy solution for it. It has to proceed the way, as you said, you can write it there, you can be politically correct and just bury your head and talk about everything, whatever you want to say. But ultimately, if you do not give us the flexibility, if the schools are not given the flexibility about at least one language, then it is not going to work. It may be whatever is written in the paper will remain on paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bhatt. So I'm come to the end of the program. I have one last question to each one of you, and the same question to all of you. For all those students, young students, but also others watching this program, what's your message? But more importantly, for all those teachers in schools across the country who are watching this, What is your message? They are working under extremely difficult circumstances. They have adapted. They have demonstrated resilience. They are actually the new age Corona warriors who are not spoken about much. What is your message to all of them? Let me start with Ms. Ghosh.
My message is that, the students as well as teachers have showed their resilience. They have showed that they are really capable of adapting, of innovating, and of rising to the occasion. And they should continue to have this quality in them in life, because this is something that is really going to hold them in good stead wherever they are. And, when children go into college from school, this is going to help them in a big way. And teachers should know that in this way, they can actually reform their teaching. They can innovate, the kind of things that the teachers have started doing and enjoying doing, that is something that should be like a lesson to all the teachers, that innovation doesn't ever stop, and that they can keep making their teaching more and more interesting and children and enjoyable to the children.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ghosh. Ms. Norula.
Well, my message is that I've never been prouder to be a teacher than I am today. And I think that the same should go with everybody. Every single teacher has so much to be proud of. And it's the whole world's watching you. The whole world is looking at how innovative and how adaptable you are to change and how amazingly important you are to their children. And make the best of this opportunity. Enjoy every minute of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Srinivasan?
Yeah, when I look at teachers, they are the ones who determine the future of the nation. Also, learning is emotional and intellectual. Teachers make the greatest impact on both these aspects, and hence they should feel proud. They should feel very blessed to be teachers. And I think there is no other profession which is better than this.
Thank you, Dr. Srinivasan and Mr. Bhatt.
I am indebted to my staff, my teachers. I feel that whatever we are today is because of them. And today, when I speak to various parents, especially because of the fees issue, if there is one complaint which is not there, it is about the teachers.
Yeah.
What they come and say is that इसके बारे में कुछ नहीं बोलना है. Teachers are wonderful. The way they have put in their efforts and the way they have learned to innovate, the way they have learned to learn new things. They have given a new definition to lifelong learning. It is not only on paper. They have actually shown that lifelong learning can happen. And I am indeed proud today to be a part of the teachers fraternity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bhatt. Dilip, as always, you have the last word.
Yeah. Well, my advice to students is learn by yourself. Do self-directed learning to the maximum extent possible. And my advice to teachers is encourage your children, encourage your students to learn by themselves to the maximum extent possible, with teachers playing an enabler's role rather than a director's role.
Well, thank you very much. I deeply appreciate the presence of all of you, Ms. Ghosh, Ms. Norula, Mr. Bhatt, Dr. Srinivasan, and of course, Dilip, for being part of this absolutely fascinating discussion. I learned a lot. I deeply appreciate your leadership, your contribution, your commitment, your dedication, and all the things that you do as a teacher, as a mentor, and of course, as a principal and an institution builder. The National Education Policy 2020, no doubt, has created an extraordinary opportunity for all of us in the wider world of education to make the best use of it, particularly with regard to its vision and aspiration, and to carve and shape its imagination that will bring out the best when it comes to policy implementation as well. I am conscious of the challenges that the NEP poses, but I'm also equally confident about the fact that we as educators are better suited to shape the future of education, and the NEP 2020 will have enough opportunities and tools to shape that thinking. I want to take this moment to thank all our audience. As you saw me messaging, I'm also replying to some questions because there are many questions which I couldn't answer as well. I want to thank my colleagues, particularly Dr. Maushmi, Nandita, Deepak, Abhinav, and many others at JGU for helping me put together this. I, of course, appreciate the contribution of our collaborator, Education World, in having this program. Once again, wish you the very best. Thank you for your contribution. This program is ended. We will again meet in 2 weeks of another episode on Eminent Educators Colloquium, which happens as a fortnightly public interest show that we do at JGU in collaboration with Education World. Thank you.